Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read some more Edgar Allan Poe. It's called The Man of the Crowd. It was well said of a certain German book that it does not permit itself to be read. There are some secrets which do not permit themselves to be told. Men die nightly in their beds, wringing the hands of ghostly confessors and looking them piously in the eyes, die with despair of heart and convulsion of throat on account of their hideousness of mysteries which will not suffer themselves to be revealed. Now and then, alas, the conscience of man takes up a burden so heavy in horror that it can be thrown down only into the grave. And thus the essence of all crime is undivulged. Not long ago, about the closing of an evening in autumn, I sat at the large bow window of the D Coffee House in London. For some months I had been ill in health and was now convalescent, and with returning strength, found myself in one of those happy moods which are so precisely the converse of ennui, moods of the keenest appendency, which the film from the mental vision departs, and the intellect, electrified, surpasses as greatly its everyday condition as does the vivid yet candid reason of Leibniz, the mad and flimsy rhetoric of Gregorius, merely to breathe with enjoyment, and I derived positive pleasure even from the many of the legitimate sources of pain. I felt a calm and inquisitive interest in everything. With a cigar in my mouth and a newspaper in my lap, I had been amusing myself with the greater part of the afternoon, now in poring over advertisements, in the observing of promiscuous company in the room, and now in peering through the smoky panes into the street. The latter is one of the principal thoroughfares of the city and had been very much crowded during the whole day. But as the darkness came on and the throng momentarily increased, by the time the lamps were well lighted, two dense and continuous tides of population were rushing past the door. At this particular period of the evening, I had never before been in a similar situation, and the tumultuous sea of human heads filled me. Therefore, with the delicious novelty of emotion, I gave up at length all cares of things within the hotel and became absorbed in the contemplation of the scene without. At first, my observations took an abstract and generalizing turn. I looked at the passengers in masses and thought of them in their aggregate relations. Soon, however, I descended into details and regarded with a minute interest in the innumerable varieties of figures, dress, air, gait, visage, and expression of countenance. By far the greater number of those who went by had a satisfied, businesslike demeanor and seemed to be thinking only of making their way through the press. Their brows were knit and their eyes rolled quickly. They pushed against by fellow wayfarers. They evinced no symptom of impatience, but adjusted their clothes and hurried on. Others, still a numerous class, were restless in their movements, had flushed faces, and talked and gesticulated to themselves as if feeling in solitude on account of the very denseness of the company around. When impeded in their progress, these people suddenly ceased muttering, but redoubled their gesticulations and waited for an absent and overtoned smile upon the lips, of course, the persons impeding them. If jostled, they bowed profusely to the jostlers and appeared overwhelmed with confusion. There was nothing very distinctive about these two large classes beyond what I have noted. Their habiliments noted to the order which is pointedly termed the decent. There was undoubtedly noblemen, merchants, attorneys, tradesmen, jock-jobblers, the trepids and the commonplaces of society, men of leisure, and men actively engaged in affairs of their own, conducting business upon their own responsibility. They did not greatly excite my attention. The tribes of clerks were an obvious one, but here I discerned two remarkable divisions. There was a junior clerk of flashing houses, young gentlemen with tight coats, bright boots, well-oiled hair, and supercilious lips, setting aside a certain dapperness of carriage, which may be termed deskism for want of a better word, the manner of which these persons seemed to me an exact facsimile of what had been the perfection of Bon Ton about 12 or 18 months before. They wore the cast-off graces of the gentry, and this, I believe, involves the best definition of class. The vision of the upper clerks of staunch firms or the steady old fellows it was not possible to mistake. These were unknown by their coats and pantaloons of black or brown, made to sit comfortably with white cravats and waistcoats, broad looking shoes, and thick hose or gaiters. They had also slightly bald heads from which the right ears, long used to pen holding, had an odd habit of standing off on end. I observed that they always removed or settled their hats with both hands and wore watches with gold chains of a substantial and ancient pattern. There was an affection of respectability. It indeed there be affection so honorable. There were many individuals of dashing appearance whom I easily understood as belonging to the race of swell pickpockets, with which all great cities are infested. I watched these gentry and with much inquisitiveness, and found it difficult to imagine how they would have ever been mistaken for gentlemen by gentlemen themselves. Their voluminous wristband, with an air of excessive frankness, which betrayed them at once. The gamblers, of whom I described not a few, were still more easily recognizable. They wore a variety of dress, and that of desperate thimble-rigged bully, with velvet waistcoat, fancy neckerchief, gilt chains, and a filigreed buttons, to that of the scrupulously ornate clergyman, than that which nothing could be less liable to suspicion. Still, all of this distinguished by a certain sidiness, swarthiness of complexion, a filmy dimness of eye, the pallor of a compression of lip. There were two other traits, moreover, by which I could always detect them: a guarded lowness of tone in conversation, and more than ordinary extension of the thumb in a direction of right angles with the finger. Very often, in company with these sharpers, I observed an order of men, somewhat different in habits, but still birds of a kindred feather. They may be defined as a gentleman who live by their wits. They seem to prey upon the public in the two battalions, that of the dandies and that of the military men. Of the first grade, the leading features are long locks and smiles, and the second frog, coats and frowns. Descending upon the scale of what termed gentility, I found darker and deeper themes of speculation. I saw Jew peddlers with hawking eyes flashing from countenances whose every other feature wore only an expression of abject humility. Sturdy professional street beggars scowling upon medicants of a better stamp, whom despair along had driven forth into the night for charity, feeble and ghastly invalids, upon whom death had placed a sure hand, and who sidled and tottered through the mob, looking every one beseechingly in the face, as if in search of a chance consolation, some lost hope. Modest young girls returning from long and late labor to a cheerless home, and shrieking from tearfully the indignantly from the glance of ruffians whose direct contact could could not be avoided, women of the town of all kinds and of all ages, the unequivocal beauty of the prime of her womanhood, putting one in mind of the statue in the Lucian and the service of Parian marble, and the interior filled with filth, the lonesome and utterly lost leper in rags, the wrinkled, bejeweled, and painted, begrimed beldame, making a last effort at youth, the mere child of immature form, yet from long association, and adept to the dreadful coquetries of their trade, and burning with a rabid ambition to be ranked the equal of her elders in vice, drunkards innumerable and indescribable, some in shreds and patches, reeling inarticulate from bruised visage and lackluster eyes, some in whole, although filthy garments and a slightly unsteady swagger, thick, sensual lips and hardy-looking rubicund faces, other clothed in materials which had once been good and which even now were scrupulously well brushed, men who walked with a more than naturally firm and springy step, but whose countenances were fearfully pale, whose eyes hideously wild and red, and who clutched with quivering fingers as they strode through the crowd in every object which came within their reach. Besides these, piemen, porters, coal heavers, sweeps, organ grinders, monkey exhibitors, and the ballad mongers, those who vended with those who sang, ragged artisans and exhausted laborers of every description, and of all full of noisy and inordinate vivacity, which jarred discordantly upon the ear and gave an aching sensation to the eye. As the night deepened, so deepened to me the interest of the scene, not only did the general character of the crowd materially alter its general features, retiring to the gradual withdrawal of the more orderly portion of the people, and its harsher ones coming out of its bolder relief, for the late hours brought forth every species of infamy from its den, but the rays of the gas lamps, feeble at first in their struggles with the dying day, and now at length gained ascendancy and threw over everything a fitful and garish luster. All was dark yet splendid, and that ebony to which had been likened the style of Tertullian. The wild effects of the light enchained me as an examination of individual faces, and although the rapidity of which the world of light flittered before the window prevented me from casting more of a glance upon each visage, still it seemed that in my then particular mental state I could frequently read, even in the brief interval of a glance, the history of the long years. With my brow to the glass, I was thus occupied in scrutinizing the mob. Then suddenly there came into the view of countenance that of a decrepit old man, some 65 or 70 years of age, a countenance which at once arrested and absorbed my whole attention from account of those absolute idiosyncrasies of its expression, anything even remotely resembling the expression I had never seen before. I will remember that my first thought upon beholding it was that Reach, had he viewed it, would have greatly preferred it to his own pictorial incarnations of the fiend, and I endeavored, during the brief minute of my original survey, to form some analysis of the meaning conveyed, where arose confusedly and paradoxically within my mind the ideas of vast mental power, of caution, of perniciousness, of avarice, of coolness, of malice, of bloodthirstiness, of triumph, of merriment, of excessive terror, of intense, of extreme despair. I felt singularly aroused, startled, and fascinated. How wild a history, I said to myself, is written within that bosom. Then came the crying desire to keep the man in view, to know more of him. Hurriedly putting on an overcoat and seizing my hat and cane, I made my way into the street, pushed through the crowd in the direction which I had seen him take. He had already disappeared. With some little difficulty, I at length came within sight of him, approached and followed him closely yet cautiously so as not to attract his attention. I had now a good opportunity to examine his person. He was short in stature, very thin, and apparently very feeble. His clothes generally were filthy and ragged, but as he now and then, within a strong glare of a lamp, I perceived that his linen, although dirty, was a beautiful texture, and by vision deceived me, though or through a rent in a closely buttoned and evidently second-handed rollicare which enveloped him, I caught a glimpse both of the diamond and of the dagger. These observations heightened my curiosity and a resolve to follow the stranger wherever he should go. I was now fully nightfall, and the thick, humid fog hung over the city, soon ending in a startled and heavy rain. This change of weather had an odd effect upon the crowd, the whole of which was at once put into a new commotion and overshadowed by the world of umbrellas. The waver, the jostle, and the hum increased in a tenfold degree. For my own part, I did not much appear regard the rain, the lurking of the old fever in my system rendering the moisture somewhat too dangerously pleasant. Trying a handkerchief about my mouth, I kept on. For half an hour, the old man held his way with difficulty along the great thoroughfare, and I here walked close at his elbow through fear of losing sight of him. Never once turning his head to look back did he observe me. By and by, he passed into a cross street, which, although densely filled with people, was not quite so much thronged as the main he had quitted. He had a chance, and his demeanor became evident. He walked more slowly and with less object than before, more hesitatingly. He crossed and recrossed and weighed repeatedly with apparent aim, and press was still so thick that at every such movement I was obliged to follow him closely. The street was a narrow and long one, and his course lay within it was nearly an hour, during which the passengers had gradually diminished to about the number of which is ordinarily seen at noon in Broadway near the park. So vast a difference in there between a London populace and that of the most frequented American city. A second turn brought us into a square, brilliantly lighted and overflowing with life. The old manner of the stranger reappeared. His chin fell upon his breast, while his eyes rolled wildly under his knit brow in every direction upon those who hemmed him in. He urged his way steadily and perversely. I was surprised, however, to find upon his having made the circuit of the square, and he turned and retraced his steps. Still more was I astonished to see him repeat the same walk several times, once nearly detecting me as he came around with a sudden movement. In this exercise he spent another hour, at the end of which we met with a far less interruption from passengers than at first. The rain fell fast and the air grew cool, and the people were retiring to their homes. With a gesture of impatience, and wanderer passed onto a by street comparatively deserted. Down this, some quarter of a mile long, he rushed with an activity I could not have dreamed of seeing no one so aged, which put me so much trouble in pursuit. A few minutes brought us to a large and busy bazaar, with the localities of which the stranger appeared well acquainted, and where his original demeanor again became apparent as he forced his way to and fro without aim among the host of buyers and sellers. During the hour and a half or whereabouts which he passed in this place, it required much caution on my part to keep him within reach without attracting his observation. Luckily, I wore a pair of cartouche overshoes and could move about in perfect silence, and in no moment did he ever see that I watched him. He entered shop after shop, priced nothing, spoke no word, looked at all objects with a wild and vacant stare. I was now utterly amazed at his behavior, and firmly resolved that he should not part until I had satisfied myself in some measure respecting him. A loud toned clock struck 11, and the company was fast deserting the bazaar. A shopkeeper, in putting up a shutter, jostled the old man, and at the instant I was a strong shudder came over his frame. He hurried into the street, looking anxiously around him for an instant, and then ran with this incredible swiftness through many crooked and peopleless lanes, until we emerged once more upon the great thoroughfare whence we had started, the street of the D Hotel. It was no longer wore, however, the same aspect. It was still brilliant with gas, but the rain fell fiercely, and there were few persons to be seen. A stranger grew pale. He walked moodily from paces upon the populous avenue, then, with a heavy sigh, turned to the direction of the river, plunged through a great variety of devious ways, came out at length in view of one of the principal theaters. It was about being closed, and the audience was thronging from the doors. I saw the old man grasp as for breath while he threw himself amid the crowd, but I thought that his intense agony of the countenance had in some measure abated. His head again fell upon his breast. He appeared as I had seen him at first. I observed that he now took the course in which had gone the greater number of the audience, but put upon the whole, as I was at a loss to comprehend the waywardness of his actions. As he proceeded, the company grew more scattered, and his old uneasiness and vacillation were resumed. For some time he followed closely a party of some 10 or 12 roisterers, but from his number one by one dropped off until three only remained together in a narrow and gloomy lane less frequented. The stranger paused and for a moment seemed lost in thought, then with every mark of agitation pursued rapidly a route which brought us to the verge of the city amid regions very different from those he had hitherto traversed. It was the most noisome quarter of London, where everything wore the worst impress of the most deplorable poverty, of the most desperate crime. By the dim light of the accidental lamp, tall, antique, worm-eaten wooden tenements were seen tottering to their fall in directions so many and capricious that scarce of the semblance of the passage was discernible between them. The paving of the stones lay at random, displaced from their beds by the ranky, gross growing grass, horribly filth festered in the dammed up gutters. The whole atmosphere teemed with desolation. Yet as we proceeded, the sounds of human life revived by sure degrees. At some length, large bands of the most abandoning of a London populace were seen in reeling to and fro. The spirits of the old man again flickered up as a lamp which is near its death hour. Once more he strode upon with elastic tread. Suddenly a corner was turned, a blaze of light burst upon our sight, and we stood before one of the huge suburban temples of intemperance, one of the palaces of the fiend Jinn. It was now partly daybreak, but a number of the wretched inebriates still pressed in and out of the flaunting entrance. With the half shriek of the joy of the old man forcing a passage within, resumed at once his original bearing and stalked backward and forward without apparent object among the throng. He had not been thus long occupied, however, before a rush to the doors gave token that the host was closing them for the night. It was something even more intense than despair when I observed upon the countenance of the singular being whom I had watched so pertinaciously, yet he did not hesitate in his career, but with a mad energy retraced his steps at once to the heart of the mighty London. Long and swiftly he fled, while I followed him in the wildest amazement, resolute not to abandon a scrutiny in which I now felt an interest in all absorbing. The sun arose while we proceeded, and when we had once again reached the most thronged mart of the populous town, the street of the D Hotel, we presented an appearance of human bustle and activity scarcely inferior to that I had seen on the evening before. And here, long amid the momentarily increasing confusion, did I persist in my pursuit of the stranger. But as usual, I walked to and fro during the day, did not pass from out of the turmoil of that street, and as the shades of the second evening came on, I grew wearied unto death, and stopped fully in front of the wanderer, gazed at him steadily in the face. He noticed me not, but resumed his solemn walk, while I, ceasing to follow, remained absorbed in contemplation. This old man, I said at length, is the type and the genius of deep crime. He refuses to be alone. He is the man of the crowd. I will be in vain to follow, for I shall learn no more of him nor of his deeds. The worst of heart of the world is the grosser book than the Hortulus Animae, and perhaps it is but one of the greatest mercies of God that at last sit nit lesson. That is the end of the man of the crowd, and if you think there's any truth or like to what I'm enjoying here, please have and enjoy your day.